Salvis Search for the Universe. Chapter 10, Part 2. Branelkoff put down his loot. He couldn't put his soul into it. He was tired, and the run-in with the bear, not to mention the tumble down the cliff, had left his instrument in quite the sorry state. It sounded awfully sour, and the acoustics were all wrong.
Hello!
A familiar face peeked its head into the craggy recess. He didn't care to reply. He just wasn't feeling up to it. She sat down across from him and fished through her pockets, pulling out vast assortments of leaves, mushrooms, twigs, and even rocks. She looked hopeful, expectant.
I can't eat any of this,
he shouted, smacking away the smorgasbord of forest trash. Salvi grasped after it as it flew away in a "if you're not going to eat it, you didn't have to waste it" kind of a way. He picked up one of the mushrooms left behind and waggled it in her face.
These are poisonous! And what is this? A rock? How am I supposed to eat a rock? Humans pretty limited, huh?
She took the mushroom out of his hand and popped it in her mouth, chewing contently. She liked the way the poison sacs burst in her mouth when she chewed. Very juicy.
Well, at least you're happy.
He crossed his arms.
What human can eat?
He froze.
Well,
he thought about it.
I don't know. Food. I've never been stranded in a forest before, so I'm dreadfully sorry I don't know all the ins and outs of wilderness survival. There's these lumpy black mushrooms. I used to eat them with my meals all the time.
She scampered over to the wall and picked up something from the pile of things he had flung away. She came back and held up a vicious-looking black mushroom.
That's not it! It's... Oh, I give up!
She made a thinking face.
Shall we find human place and bring human food? Yes! By all means, leave me here, all starving and alone. I'm sure it will just go swimmingly.
He threw up his hands sarcastically. Even if she managed to find a village before he starved, the chances of her finding her way back were next to none without any sort of divine intervention. Salvi leered at him and said,
If say so,
and stood up. Branelkoff launched himself forward, falling belly first into the dusty gravel, and grabbed her ankle.
I'm sorry. I was just joking. Please don't leave me.
Salvi sighed and rolled her eyes.
Why human talk so...
What was the word?
Complicated.
That was the word. For Branelkoff, suppressing his natural instinct to be as sarcastic as possible was like a turd trying to suppress its smell. But he would need to try his best, at least until he was out of this situation, if ever.
Meat! I can eat meat!
He declared.
Isn't there a lot of meat running around this forest? Just catch some of that. Shall we try? But meat fast!
She shook her head.
Never catch.
Obviously, she had tried many times before.
And rotten meat always hurt Salvi's stomach.
He was surprised that there was anything that could hurt her stomach.
Well, if you're thinking about bringing me some half-desecrated vulture leftovers, don't! I can't eat them either. Ain't Kobold supposed to be great at making traps? Just trap something!
She looked away guiltily, lacing her hands behind her back and kicking a small puff of dust under her reptilian toes.
Salvi bad at make traps,
she admitted shyly. Obviously, it was a point of great shame. Branelkoff groaned. It was hopeless. Hopeless.
Can't you at least try? Salvi can try,
she said in the same way one might say they could try to move a man-sized boulder, or hit a bullseye from 200 yards.
Try! Yes, try! Take lots time.
It was really hopeless. He laid back, shielding his eyes with his wrist.
I'm going to starve before you finish, ain't I?
He had already broken his goal of being less sarcastic within seconds of setting it. She looked guilty and regretful, then stuck her hand into her pocket again and pulled out some fat, white grubs, writhing and pulsing like the horrific abominations they were. Obviously, she was hoping she could save them for herself. Just looking at them made him want to vomit, if his stomach contained anything worth spewing up. But his stomach growled like a lion. He couldn't, but he was so hungry. Before he knew it, his hand was reaching out and grabbed one of the things. It had a mind of its own as he crushed the smooth, chitinous helmet and pinched it clean off before putting it in his mouth. His jaw moved. It squished and popped and spewed grub juice between his molars. He gagged and swallowed out of surprise, as much as the desire to stop the taste no matter what. He breathed hard, drained as if he had just washed ashore after nearly drowning. It assaulted his noble tongue, and it was worse than he could ever describe. But he grabbed another one, repeating the laborious, mind-breaking process until they were all gone. And then Salvi revealed her second pocket, filled with even more fat, white squirmers. He tried his best not to vomit, so his pain and suffering would not all be for waste. Shadow Walker, Night Stalker, White Eyes, the Spider. He had many names, but what did he call himself? I, me, and my were all he needed. What use was a name? He only knew two kinds of people, clients and targets. The former already knew who he was, and the latter never needed to know. So, again, what use was a name? What had his mother named him? He did not know. His childhood had not been kind, but so much was obvious. You did not become a professional killer because it was fun. You did it because you had no other choice. Though he had worked alongside some true psychotics that seemed to enjoy the work, but they took too much joy in the kill and inevitably destroyed themselves in the end. He was more meticulous than that, and that attitude is why he remained one of the oldest assassins alive. He had never failed a job, or that was what most thought. Secretly, he had failed one job when he was young, but killed a client so it would never get out. But as far as he was concerned, he had never failed a job, and he had not failed this one either. Sure, he failed to kill Lord Farisles, but that did not mean he had failed the job, simply that it was being postponed. And nor did he fail to get the pendant, for he would have it soon enough. That Kobold on their side was tricky, he had to admit, but they were sloppy, assuming he had died from that chandelier. His body still ached. He couldn't move like he used to, but it was more than enough. Several of his bones had been broken by that, but it wasn't anything a stinger couldn't momentarily. Not fix, but obscure. Once this job was over, he'd need to meet one of his menders and get everything back where it should be. He had work to do. He jabbed another stinger into his side and squeezed the venomous sac, pumping it into his veins. It forked like cold lightning from his ribs and shot through his limbs down to the tips of his fingers and toes. His next breath fogged like the middle of winter. Amazing. He had heard they were made by carefully excising the abdomen of Mythian wasps and adding in what the supplier called the secret sauce to create their own noxious concoction. But he cared little for the craft behind them, so long as they worked. Perhaps he was overly reliant on these things. They had turned his eyes white some time ago. But worrying about health risks in his line of work was like hoarding money before the apocalypse. He walked stealthily under the dark, moonless sky. His night vision was exceptionally good, and so he had no trouble navigating the twisting Sylvian landscape and shrub-littered paths, for lack of a better term. Truthfully, they were as far from paths as you could get. It had taken him days and days of searching these woods, for his quarry was terribly clever and so very skilled at concealing themselves. But he had found them. Finally, he had found them. Something like excitement tingled through his body for the first time in years. He couldn't stop himself from grinning. He had spotted a kobold earlier in the day, but he had not engaged them. No! He was more meticulous than that. Direct confrontation were your last resort, and he could not be certain of their skill and preparation. Instead he followed them from the shadows, found where they were camped, and bided his time, until night fell upon him. Likely they were waiting for reinforcements. An entire mercenary band was likely on their way to transport that pendant safely to whomever their employer was. That meant there was no time to waste. His knife itched to be drawn. He drifted through the bush like a moving shadow, nearly soundless, as if slipping through the perception of the forest itself. He would not fail this time. Tears streamed down Branelkoff's face. He grovelled in the dirt, throwing a nearly convulsive fit, moaning and wailing in pleasure. 9 days. 9 days without food, not counting the grubs which were forgotten for the sake of his sanity. The meat was charred, cooked unevenly and of the gamiest meats around, but it was the best thing he'd ever tasted.
"You're an angel! Oh, you're an absolute angel!"
He cried, meat juices streaming in rivulets down his shin. Salvi looked shocked, then looked obscurely smug. When she poked her head into the cave with a rabbit dangling from her claws by the ears, he had thrown his arms around her like a long-separated lover. He would have hugged and kissed the Lord of the Dark himself if he had brought him meat. The appearance of meat had redoubled his efforts at making fire, and before long he had managed to spark a fire into life. Moments before his arms felt ready to fall off and careen into the side of the cave. As it turns out, it was most effective to spin one stick between your palms into a plank of wood, rather than rubbing two of them together. Fortunately, his hands were used to moving at speed, so once he found the technique, it wasn't nearly as hard as he had thought. Neither of them had apparently cooked anything in their entire lives. So, gutting the animal and cooking the meat relied more on instinct and intuition rather than anything else. But if one good thing could be said about the end result, it would be that it was definitely edible, and that was all he needed. He grabbed his loot, lifted it to his lips, and tilted it towards his mouth. Cold stream water leaked from the acoustic carving in the center. Drinking it was awkward, and most of it spilled uselessly onto the ground beside him. Salvi had started using it to transport water since a few days ago, without his permission, of course. She had seemed very proud of herself when she returned, holding his loot as it made suspicious squelching noises. Using his loot like that galled him, but it was half broken, and it wasn't like he had any better ideas. He finished the last bit, licking his fingers and sucking the bones clean. He eyed the mass of guts and organs, and seriously considered finding some way of cooking those too. He sat back. He wished he could say he was satisfied, but he wasn't. One rabbit simply wasn't enough to fill the rumbling void inside his stomach, but it was a start.
"I dare say. Some more of that and I'll be fit to travel."
He was happy. Everything was starting to look up. He gripped the walking stick he had carved in his free time and struggled to his feet. It rattled and shook like a loose pin securing a windmill during a storm, but he managed to get to his feet. He really didn't want to admit that Salvi was right, but it was probably just a bad sprain. Lucky guess, most likely. While he didn't want to admit that, he would readily admit that he had underestimated the scaly creature. A few days ago he had envisaged himself a corpse.
"Salvi, look more!"
She chewed on the spare bones and raw guts. The idea seemed to excite her. He didn't know what she was after, but she seemed very eager to get going. She stood and wiped the leftovers from the bloody entrails from her face with her sleeve, which made Branelkoff cringe. If he had done that in the manor, the head maid would have beaten him to death with a washboard. Propriety be damned. After defacing her clothes, she turned and vanished. Branelkoff stretched his leg, preparing them to move once again. Salvis stepped out of the cave. Taking care of that human sure was a lot of work. She wondered how humans were even alive, if they were this needy. It was as if they just died from being outside of their walls. But maybe that was why they were so smart in the first place. Yes, that made sense. She congratulated herself for the thought and went on. The forest was uneven, and the ground was covered in twisting roots, diving half-submerged in and out of the ground like a bowl of gigantic worms. The dense forest canopy shaded the whole forest. Little shrubs could grow in the nutrient-choked soil and sun-sheltered floor. Rocks littered here and there, the logical continuation of the cliff they had fallen from, only covered in layers of dirt. Everything was sloped down, leading to the one central stream that led through the valley. After spending so many days here, even she was learning how to navigate these woods. She found a place she used for making traps. The knife she took from the scary man inside a castle really came in handy. Tying together all that rope from scavenged plant fibers took forever, not to mention all the wood she had to carve up. She had considered just throwing it all down and leaving without a human, but he had been an excellent guide up until they got attacked by the bear. So, when she thought about it, really thought about it, spending an extra week or two to save the human would probably save her more time in the long run. It had only taken her the better part of a week to think of it like that. She made her way to a small clearing full of hedges and bushes. The ground was littered with animal droppings, so it seemed as good a place as any. She went to check on her first trap. It had apparently caught something, but subsequently fell apart into a pile of useless sticks with the animal long gone. Well, what could she expect? She had made it after all. She went to check on a second trap, and shockingly it had snagged something, and whatever it had snagged was still there. It was really big. It was some kind of animal with short brown fur and a long face, and big pointy sticks coming out of its head, kind of like her own horns, but nowhere near as good looking. It was thrashing and belting, so she went up to it and stabbed it in the throat. It took a while for it to stop, and just like that, a living thing had turned into nothing more than meat. But the philosophical significance was once again lost upon her. It would take some effort to haul the whole thing back to the cave. Maybe she could just cut it up and take the good bits. Though the whole thing looked good to her. It looked like a lot of effort. Maybe later. She went to go check on the third trap. It was probably the best one she had managed to make. She brushed the leaves aside, entering the clearing, then turned around and walked straight back to the cave.
What is all this about?
Branelkoff stammered as Salvi pushed him from behind. He stumbled forward.
Stop pushing me, you scaly buffoon! You're going to make me trip! Branelkoff need look!
She kept pushing despite his wishes, and he moved like a seasick ragdoll.
Look at what?
Salvi let the question hang for several dozen minutes, until she managed to hike the crippled man all the way there. She spread apart the bushes and pointed forward. Branelkoff stepped forward, brushing leaves off his clothes with an irritated expression, and finally looked ahead. Then his eyes rolled up. About 7 feet off the ground, someone dangled from their heels, their hands far above their heads, in what looked like an inverted chair. They rotated slightly in the breeze, like meat on a spit. His face was obscured by the black mantle, hanging over his face up to his elbows.
I thought you said you were bad at making traps. Supposed to kill instantly.
She shrugged. It was then that he realized kobolds had a very different standard when it came to traps. He looked all around at the mechanisms made of whittled wood and ropes made from twisted vines. Anyone who could turn plants into snares, sophisticated enough to hang a grown man 7 feet in the air, was practically an expert in his book.
What do?
She looked at him questioningly. Branelkoff scratched his whiskey chin. It had gotten quite rough over the past several days. He looked at the man, especially keenly at the pure black clothing and the large assortment of knives, poisons, and other nefarious devices whose purpose he was apparently too law-abiding to understand.
I think it best we just leave him there.
He had seen his ilk before.
Won't human die? Probably not. I'm sure he'll find his own way out eventually. Those slippery bastards are always like that. Though I think it's best we leave sooner rather than later.
He looked at Salvi. They shared a shrug, turned, and left. He limped through the bushes.
So you're saying you caught an entire deer?
His voice died off in the distance. The rope creaked one way until the tension forced it to turn the other way, back and forth, back and forth, constantly, constantly. The man wished they had just killed him to put him out of his misery.